August 30th, 1935. The Bronx, New York. Hoodlum Benny Holinski is driving up 3rd Avenue. In the rear sits fellow hoodlum Frank Dolek. Riding shotgun is one of their Confederates, Fred Miller, whom they just picked up. They are heading to a rendezvous with the rest of their gang to plan their next caper. In addition to Holinski, who is a former member of the now-defunct Leonard Scarnici gang, Dolek and Miller, the gang consists of Harold Brooks, known as Shake, who did a stint in Washington state for a robbery and was picked up in New York City in 1928 for extortion. He is co-leader of the gang with Al Stern, a cokehead bandit who is currently wanted for killing an off-duty cop during a robbery the previous year. Rounding out the mob is another Scarnici alumnus named Irving Red Blonner, Louis L. Brock, Edward Knott, Irving Amron and Sam Aronson. The men are flush with cash. 8 days earlier the gang successfully ransomed the bookie named Battisto Salvo for $9,000. The idea was Brooks's. Kidnapping gangsters wasn't a new thing. It had been going on for years. Generally speaking, the upside of abducting a denizen of the underworld was that you didn't need to worry about police involvement. The downside was, fellow gangsters didn't concern themselves with jurisprudence. If you were found out, there would be no trials, only executions. When Brooks put forth his proposition, Holinski said he knew a good victim. The top policy man in Westchester, Battisto Salvo. He was a partner with a mob guy, who was affiliated with Mafia boss Vincent Allo, aka Jimmy Blue Eyes. Whether or not they realized that they were messing with the Mafia or if they even cared is unknown. On August 19, Holinski led Brooks, Stern and Fred Miller to a used car dealership in the Bronx that Salvo often frequented in the operation of his business. Holinski pointed out Salvo as he exited his car and entered the office. Driving back to Brooks's apartment, Holinski was dropped off. Since Salvo knew him, he wouldn't be in on the snatch. Dolek, Aronson, Elbrock and Knott left with Brooks and Stern. They parked inconspicuously around the used car lot and waited. After a while, Salvo exited the office and headed towards his sedan. When he was a few feet away, he saw the men closing in on him and made a dash for his car door. The gang grabbed him before he could enter. The policy man put up a fight but was dazed by a blow to the head with a pistol butt and crammed into his own back seat. Salvo was taken to Brooks's apartment and placed under guard. Brooks and Aronson drove Salvo's car to a drugstore and placed a call to the policy man's partner. He was informed that Salvo had been kidnapped and that it would cost $25,000 to get him back. To prove their claim, they told him where he could find Salvo's car. After dickering back and forth for 3 days, the gang agreed to a $9,000 ransom. Once payment was received, Salvo was turned loose. The gang returned to their lair and split up the money. While the kidnappers went on a spending spree, Salvo was debriefed by his Mafia associates. If it was the gang's intent to remain anonymous to their mob victim, they failed. Holinski, Dolek and Miller weren't worried about mob vengeance that August 30th, as they drove through the Bronx. After going a bit, Holinski noticed that they were being followed. Assuming that they were being tailed by detectives, he pulled over to the curb. The mystery car pulled abreast of them. In a flash 3 men were in the street with guns blazing. Hit numerous times, Holinski slunk over the wheel. Trapped in the back seat, Dolek also caught a large dose of lead. Miller managed to slide out his door onto the sidewalk. Getting up, he zigzagged down the street while one of the gunmen chased him while firing. The gunmen climbed back into their car and fled the scene. Holinski and Dolek were still alive when authorities arrived. They were rushed to the hospital but refused to talk. Holinski died the following day and Dolek succumbed to his wounds on September 2nd. After identifying Holinski and Dolek, detectives picked up Aronson, who they knew was their friend. After hours of questioning, he started to spill the beans on the gang. On September 6th, Miller, Knott and Elbrock were jailed. While police were working on the double murder, mob boss Vincent Allo learned that another of those involved was Irving Amron, who was a pal of another hoodlum named Abraham Mir. Mir happened to be acquainted with Walter Sage, a killer associated with Murder Incorporated. Because of the Sage-Mir connection, the Brooklyn Murder Squad got the contract. The plan was to use Mir to lure Amron to Brooklyn where both would be killed. The fact that Mir didn't take part in the kidnapping was inconsequential. He would have to go too. On September 15, Amron and Mir ventured to the Brownsville section of Brooklyn supposedly to collect money from someone. Sage was going to assist them in some fashion, but it was all a ruse. After picking the Bronx duo up in a car, Sage and another Murder Inc. subordinate known as Duke Mafator drove them to a specific location a little after 10 p.m. When they pulled up, two Murder Inc. killers, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss and Bugsy Goldstein, approached the car. Posing as detectives, they took Amron and Mir into custody. The two men were placed up against a garage wall. Pulling out sawed-off shotguns, the Murder Inc. killers each fired at one of the Bronx boys. Mir dropped with a gaping hole in his chest. Somehow, Goldstein missed. So Amron was forced into their car and taken to Goldstein's brother's house where they questioned him for hours regarding the kidnapping. In the early hours of the 16th, while real detectives were already working on the Mir murder, Strauss and Goldstein released Amron as promised. He was allowed to get into a car with Walter Sage and Duke Mafator. Within minutes, Sage shot him in the head numerous times. They abandoned the car with Amron's corpse in the back seat. He was found a few hours later at around 6:30 a.m. A few days later, while in custody, Aronson broke and told about the kidnapping of Salvo, and, less than a week after the Amron and Mir killings, the policy man was picked up on September 21. Despite the confession of one of his abductors, Salvo denied that he had been kidnapped. This put the police in a conundrum. They had two dead bodies, actually four, but they wouldn't learn the truth about Amron and Mir until the Murder Incorporated trials, which were still a half-decade off. Police knew a kidnapping had taken place, but Salvo remained mum while the mob continued to parcel out justice in their own way. Whether or not it was because Amron talked, Allo learned who the remaining kidnappers were. The next to go was Harold Shake Brooks. He may have been lured to his death under some pretense. Shortly before 1 p.m. on October 15, Brooks stood at Madison Avenue and 120th Street leisurely smoking a cigarette. While numerous students were returning to their school after the lunch hour, a car pulled up and a man hopped out. Running up to Brooks, the gunman fired several shots into him. As the gang leader dropped, the shooter returned to the car and made his escape. Later that night it was Irving Red Blauner's turn. Riding shotgun in a car driven by his friend Albert Plug Schumann, Red no doubt felt safe. Sitting behind him was Louis Palermo, a.k.a. Shorty the Wop, a mobster with ties to Joseph Sox Lanza. As they drove along, Palermo drew a pistol and fired 2 shots into the back of Red's neck. Schumann pulled into Central Park and they dumped Blauner in some bushes. A short time later, Blauner was found and, miraculously, was still alive. He was taken to the hospital and had no qualms saying who put him on the spot. At 6:30 the following evening, as Plug Schumann was walking up to his dentist's office on the Lower East Side, a gunman shot him down before he had a chance to enter. Like Blauner, Schumann survived. Perhaps the mob attempted to kill him before the police had a chance to get him. Whatever the reason, Schumann kept his mouth shut. The only remaining kidnapper not dead or in custody was Al Stern, and things were heating up for him. In the first hours of October 23, gangster Louis Pretty Amberg's body was found in a flaming automobile in Brooklyn. Since both his murder and that of his brother Joseph, who was bumped off on September 30, coincided with those of the Salvo kidnappers, the press put 2 and 2 together and got 5. They decided that Stern had probably killed Amberg, and he appeared in all the papers and his name was trumpeted as one of the worst mad dog killers in the New York underworld. In actuality, Stern had nothing to do with Amberg's death. It was a Murder Incorporated job. In fact, Stern wasn't even in New York when Amberg got it. Trying to keep one step ahead of both the cops and the mob, he had fled to Newark, New Jersey at least 3 days before Amberg was hit. He moved into a cheap boarding house after a local man stated that he had found him begging on the street. Supposedly the man brought him to the house and the landlady felt sorry for him and let him stay for free. Ironically, Newark was probably the worst place he could have been. After his name was in all the papers on October 23, that night New York City mobster Dutch Schultz and 3 of his gang members were gunned down in a Newark tavern. Stern caught the blame for that killing as well. Down and out and knowing that if the cops got him, it would be the electric chair, and if the mob got him first, they wouldn't bother with a trial, he decided to be his own executioner. Putting pencil to paper, he wrote a note to his girlfriend, "Darling, this is goodbye. Life is not worth living without you. One who loves you more than life itself. Please take it as I would want you to. Remember the lilacs. Al." With that, he stood on the bed and knotted his tie around a gas jet open to high and cheated society and the mob out of justice. The following January 1936, the surviving kidnappers went on trial for snatching salvo. L. Brock, Miller and Knott drew long sentences and were sent to prison. Aronson and Blonner, who had turned state's evidence, were let go. Salvo, who never admitted to being kidnapped, was found guilty of obstructing justice and sentenced to up to 3 years. Shorty the Wop was identified by a witness as the killer of Brooks, but nothing came of it. In 1938 he went on trial for the attempted murder of Red Blonner. Pleading guilty to first-degree assault, he was sentenced from 8.5 to 18 years. Walter Sage, who murdered Irving Amron, was himself the recipient of a gruesome gangland death at the hands of his Murder Inc. associates. In the summer of 1937 his corpse was found in a Catskills lake. He had been strangled and stabbed multiple times with an ice pick. Albert "Plug" Schumann recovered from the attempt on his life in 1935 only to be successfully bumped off on January 10, 1939 on orders from Louis Lepke Buckleter, who believed that he was a police informer. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing.